Welcome back to Videos on the Ville. This is a discussion of the Canadian economy. This is Canadian Government and Politics at Millersville University, and I'm Dr. Charles Greenewalt. Happy to have you join us for this discussion of the Canadian economy. If you have any questions about content, please send me an email or give me a call. I'm happy to talk with any of you anytime, Monday through Friday, 9 to 9, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. Feel free to call me or email me. Okay, well, actually, as I should correct myself, Monday through Saturday. Monday through Saturday is fine. Well, we find when we look at the Canadian economy that we had a very distinct proclamation by a Canadian Prime Minister. In 1904, the Liberal Prime Minister of Canada, Wilfrid Laurier, of the Liberal Party, he proclaimed, "The 20th century belongs to Canada. The 20th century belongs to Canada." It was a bold prediction, but it wasn't unreasonable. Canada is a vast territory, as you know. It's the second largest country in the world right now, second only to Russia. It had a rapidly increasing population at the time, and Canada has enormous reserves of unexploited mineral and agricultural resources. So believing that the 20th century would belong to Canada might not be too far off the mark. We find that Canada's always been brimming with economic potential and corresponding expectations of unmatched and ever-increasing prosperity. You find that society in Canada is perceived as a great example of stability, and you find that the lack of racial conflicts, the lack of open class warfare, the lack of too much abject poverty, and the lack of revolutionary upheavals all go to produce this strong image of stability within Canadian society. Furthermore, you find that what else have the Canadians survived, and the Canadian economy survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, establishing functional independence for itself vis-a-vis the British Empire. Canada emerges in the second half of the 20th century as a prosperous, stable democracy. You find that even at the height of its power, the Canadian economy has remained undeveloped and is very sensitive, and has always been sensitive, to investment decisions that are made outside the country. After the Second World War, you find a control over the Canadian economy shifted. It shifted from London to New York City, to America. You find that disputes between Ottawa and the western provinces over the extent of federal jurisdiction over control of resources discouraged investments in Canada, and it hampered the development of Canadian resources. Wilfrid Laurier's boast remained unfulfilled. Canada belonged to the 20th century rather than the 20th century belonging to Canada. And of course, on your PowerPoints that you should have by your side, or you should have on your laptop with an easy viewing range, there's a picture there of Wilfrid Laurier, excuse me, in the lower right-hand side of your PowerPoint. Well, what are the economic conditions that you find in the Canadian economy? It's a small economy. It's an open economy. The population of Canada is only 1/10 the size of the United States. However, international trade constitutes a much larger percentage of their gross national product. You find that international trade constitutes 25% of their gross national product as opposed to the United States' 6%. The Canadian economy, therefore, is more vulnerable to influences and disruptions of the world trade system than is the American. Find entrepreneurs and financial institutions have to compete with American and with foreign counterparts for capital in money markets, the money markets of New York, London, Europe, and Tokyo. You find that what's probably true is that there isn't any other advanced industrialized country in the world. There's no other advanced industrialized country in the world that's been so successfully penetrated and completely dominated by direct foreign investment than Canada's is. Historically, economic development in Canada has been based on the exploitation of natural resources, whether that be fish, whether it be fur, forest products, grain, or any variety of minerals. Canada's rich endowment, if you will, their rich endowment of forests, farmland, fuel, non-fuel minerals, and fresh water continues to be a great source of economic strength for the Dominion. In Alberta, oil in particular has generated a wave of industrial and manufacturing ventures, in addition to increasing demands for consumer products, advanced technology, improved transportation facilities, and investment capital, all happening in Alberta. Find traditionally what has been the economic heartland of Canada. Of course, it's been Ontario and Quebec. They have formed the economic heartland. Industrialization began early in Canada, and it kept pace with America, at least in the heavily populated areas around the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. And there is a map in your PowerPoints, again on the lower right-hand side of the page. You find that the heavily urbanized Montreal to Toronto to Windsor corridor along the north shores of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario have been the center of Canada's manufacturing industries and their development finance. However, as we look at the last 4 decades, we look at the last 40 years, economic activity in Canada has shifted westward, and there's no doubt that this trend will continue to be true. The distribution of material resources will favor the western provinces. The West has 70% of the land area in Canada, but only 25% of the population. Western resources include what? Western resources include more than half of all the timber that could be marketable. So Western resources in Canada include more than half of all the marketable timber, 80% of all arable farmland, almost all the proven oil reserves of Canada, with the exception of what? With the exception of Hibernia. Hibernia is a large area off the coast of Newfoundland, which has vast oil resources that have just begun to be tapped. You find most of all the reserves that Canada has in coal, industrial gas, and uranium are found in the West. Economic growth in Manitoba and economic growth in Saskatchewan really are dependent upon what? They're dependent upon the price of grain. If we have increases in the price of grain and improvements in the transportation system to move that grain, that permits greater economic growth in the prairies. Alberta's boom is based on high prices and high demand for petroleum, and as serving as a supply base, if you will, for exploration and for development in the western Arctic and the high Arctic areas. What we find, though, as development in Alberta has proceeded, you have a critical shortage of labor in Alberta. Alberta has needed more skilled labor for many years. As, of course, as the fisheries collapsed in Newfoundland, a generation ago because of the Canadian government permitted overfishing by many European fishing fleets in the Georges Bank, for which many Newfoundlanders will never forgive them. Those same Newfoundlanders had to pack their suitcases and move to Alberta, and they went from being fishermen to being working in oil rigs. You find that Newfoundland every summer, I'm wrong, excuse me, once every 3 to 4 years, I'm not sure of the interval anymore, but once every so many years, Newfoundland has a homecoming where all the folks who are scattered across the Dominion have a week where they can come back to Newfoundland and all see one another again and enjoy their ancestral homes. I happened to be in Newfoundland for one of those celebrations, and it was very exciting. It was the enjoyment, the joy of the people was clearly evident, and Newfoundland, I was very lucky to be in Newfoundland at that particular point in time. It was a true celebration. Well, there's certainly challenges to northern development, and the challenges to northern development will be what? Well, the fluctuating prices for commodities is a big challenge. You also have environmental problems that need to be addressed. We have disputed land claims, particularly with Russia under the Arctic. And you have a national shortage of capital, at least in Canada. For the time being, those challenges have been met and they have been addressed. Will that continue into the future? I don't know. None of us can see that far. Canada certainly hopes so. British Columbia. What does economic development look like in British Columbia? They've been confronted now and again with a soft market for forest products. They will benefit, no doubt, from spin-offs from resource-based development in the prairies. They built new port facilities, they have improved rail lines, and the province has been very active in soliciting foreign capital just for economic activity in the province. Well, what are the trends, economic trends that we find in the Canadian economy? Inflation has traditionally been lower than the United States. Consumer loans, however, have been difficult to obtain because of a tightness of capital. And you find that there's a big difference in home ownership because, unlike American homeowners, Canadians are not allowed to deduct their mortgage interest payments from their taxes. And if they can't deduct their mortgage interest payments from their taxes, there's far less of an incentive to buy a home as opposed to rent. Trends, again, unemployment in Canada has traditionally been lower than in the United States. The government deficit as a percentage of the gross national product is also lower than the United States. Tax rates that were at an all-time high, and they were higher than in the United States. This is as the liberal governments were passing out of power, and the conservative governments were coming into power of Stephen Harper. You find that those tax rates now have fallen, and those tax rates now are lower than American rates, and Canada has put its financial house in order, and it was a bipartisan effort between the liberals and the conservatives. Solutions to economic problems in Canada? Well, one is certainly to pump more money into the economic system. They need more capital for financing of different ventures. We have to always worry if you pump too much money into the economic system, it might produce unacceptably high inflation. Although the world in the last decade has seemed to have that under control momentarily. I wouldn't look for that to continue indefinitely, however. You find that if we pump more money into the economic system, you wonder if it might hurt Canadian productivity. Canadian productivity, unfortunately, is the worst in the industrialized world. And their productivity is so low, according to organizations that do these kind of studies, such as the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development believe that Canadian productivity is the worst in the industrialized world. You find that wage levels and production costs are abnormally high in Canada. Canadian workers are paid exceedingly well, and the production costs are high as well. You find, on the other hand, Canadian saving rates are much better than you find in America. Canadians generally save 3 times as much as Americans do as a household. They generally save 13.5% of their paycheck. That's triple the rate of America at the present. Canadian economy has traditionally faced the peril. They always are concerned about the peril of recession, and that is because no nation has depended more heavily on free trade and expanding trade for its economic well-being. Out of every $10 in Canada's gross national product, $3 is earned from exports. How much is earned in the United States and in the American economy? 85 cents. So out of every $10 of Canadian gross national product, 3 is earned from exports, whereas in every $10 of America's gross national product, 85 cents, only 85 cents, is earned from exports. Well, let's take a look for a moment at the evolution of the most important economic relationship that Canada has, and that's the relationship with the United States. As we look at the evolution of the American-Canadian economics relationship, if you will, we find that Canada's survival as a separate country since the Revolutionary War has featured at its center anti-Americanism. So anti-Americanism has always been at the core of Canada's survival as a separate country since the Revolutionary War. These two economies have been highly interdependent all through our histories, but both the French and the English Canadians have long been suspect. They've been wary, they've been suspicious of the free-wheeling style of American business and fearful of being absorbed into the American economic and political orbit. And differences between America and Canada, you find that when they've been expressed, one of the easiest and best places to express them have been through economic policy. You find that Canadians have assigned a much greater role to the government in terms of shaping the country's overall economic development. Government in Canada has been instrumental in organizing and financing, for example, the Canadian Transcontinental Railroad. So Canadians have assigned a much greater role to this government in shaping the country's overall economic development. Most of Canada's economic history can be explained in terms of defensive maneuvering that they've had to do to prevent full-scale economic integration with America. And of course, this is why it was very important for the Canadians to develop their own transcontinental railway and not rely on America's. You find Canadian living standards are tied directly to those in America, and Canadian economic ties with America. However, they've not been close or strong always, even though we do have a very close and intimate relationship with our economies. It's not always been close, not always been strong. Prior to the 1840s, we find Upper and Lower Canada, that would be Ontario and Quebec, along with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, they enjoyed preferential trading agreements with the United Kingdom. Most of the trade of Canada was oriented towards the United Kingdom, and Montreal competed directly with New York City as the major distribution center for goods that were en route from the North American market to Europe. You find many Canadian merchants encouraged free entry of American goods into Canada, and then those American goods that would be shipped from Canada to Europe were sold in Europe under the preference agreement. Well, the United Kingdom changed all of this by adopting free trade in 1840. So, and as of 1840, no longer did Canada's raw material exports enjoy such a vast advantage over American goods. And as Canada gained more and more political autonomy, English-speaking merchants led a drive to unify Canada with the United States. Well, despite the lack of unification, in 1854, we had a Reciprocity Treaty, and the Reciprocity Treaty with Canada further stimulated American-Canadian trade. We abolished all duties on all products. We abolished all duties on all products of farms, forests, mines, and fisheries. Now, the one thing that was excluded from this was what? Manufactured products. Manufactured products were excluded from the agreement. Canadians have always been careful to try to preserve some of their factories. Did you ever notice, particularly I can speak for the men in the audience here, when you go looking for men's clothing, it's very hard to find any men's clothing made in the United States. It seems that you can always find some made in Canada yet. Canadians have been careful to try to preserve a minimal number of manufacturing industries in each sector. Well, in 1867, America refused to renew the Reciprocity Treaty. They refused to renew the Reciprocity Treaty because of British and Canadian trade with Confederacy during the Civil War. Since the English and the Canadians seemed to have a stake in the Civil War, that it was far better for the South to have won, America did not renew the Reciprocity Treaty. So Canada established protective trade barriers to try to help indigenous manufacturing even more. Well, this leads eventually in 1879 to one of the most famous periods of Canadian economic history, and that is the national policy. This was, in fact, a leading policy of the Conservative Party. In 1879, the national policy, Canada's first comprehensive economic development package. Canada's first comprehensive economic development package. What did the national policy consist of? It had multiple prongs. Number one, higher tariffs, so the protection of Canadian industry. Higher tariffs, more railroad construction, accelerated settlement of the West. So the first element was higher tariffs, railroad construction, and accelerated Western settlement. The second element was these higher import prices that result from higher tariffs would increase aggregate demand within Canada for domestically produced goods. And this stimulated economic output and stimulated employment. Tariffs indeed provided up to 75% of the total revenue for the federal government. This changed as Canada, like America, implemented an income tax during the First World War. Well, since 1945, the U.S.-Canadian trade relationship has grown to a greater extent than any two nations' economic relationship. We find that since 1945, both America and Canada had participated in the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, so they both participated in GATT. They were both involved with the Automotive Agreement of 1965. The Automotive Agreement of 1965 established free trade in automobiles and automobile parts. And then they also, Canada and the United States, signed the Defense Production Sharing Agreement. The Defense Production Sharing Agreement was an agreement through NATO. What would be true is that America and Canada would share defense manufacturing for NATO between two countries. Well, Canada's outlook and perspective on their economy and on trade does take a turn during the tenureship of Pierre Elliott Trudeau in the prime ministership, and while the Liberal Party controls the Parliament in the late 60s through the early 1980s. So the Trudeau regime, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, we find that the Liberal government conducted a comprehensive review of Canada's foreign and economic policy, and it came up with three alternatives. The three alternatives for the country were, number one, we could maintain the status quo. We could maintain the status quo. Number two would be to drop Canada's productive barriers altogether and press for full-scale economic integration with America. So number two was to drop Canada's protective trade barriers and to press for full-scale economic integration with America. The third option that the Trudeau government set forth for consideration was decreased reliance on America as a trading partner and more reliance upon the European community, Japan, and the Third World. Well, under the Pierre Trudeau regime and under the Liberal government, they chose the third option. But the third option, trying to reduce their reliance on America and more reliance upon the European community, Japan, and the Third World, that failed to produce significant economic results. The European and Asian markets have always been highly protected, and that those trade barriers combined with a worldwide recession and the OPEC oil price increases dealt a death blow to the Trudeau's regime's course of action when it came to international trade. So in 1981, Canada turns back to the American market. And shortly after, we have the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. The Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, or CUSTA. Of course, the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement ultimately evolves into what we know as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And on that note, I will wrap up my talk about the Canadian economy. If you want to discuss anything that we've gone over here, have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me. Okay? Well, hope you're doing well. I hope to hear from all of you soon.